Okay, then, let's get to it, everyone. Let's get perspectives on this one. I have joining me in the studio here, Mr. Olariwaju Suraj is the chairman of Civil Society Network Against Corruption. Many thanks for coming on the program tonight. First and foremost, let me get your thoughts on the issue of the Paris Club refund. The president has said the first 50% have been promised must be paid off before December. But for a lot of people who have heard this kind of news over and over again, this perhaps will be the third tranche of the Paris Club refund. But they have not really gotten their salaries back. What do you think will be going on in their minds right now?
It is the usual mistrust and the fear of, well, not even the unknown now, of the known, which is usually the antecedents of many of the governors. You will also remember what happened with the initial release of such fund, where some of these governors actually outrightly diverted those funds. In fact, some of those who were not there, even as serving governors, got a huge share in terms of billions of naira from this Paris Club payment, which was actually meant to pay for the workers, which was actually meant to pay salaries and reduce the burden of non-payment of salaries on many of the workers. And unfortunately, what you've seen is such a situation where those monies were, like I said, diverted by these governors under the banner of the Governors Forum. And unfortunately, they are still actually walking the street and walking away with it.
Can they be investigated?
Yeah.
Because these are funds that will touch the lives of people who are working every day, but they don't have a hope of how their salaries are going to be paid. And those monies are actually there for them to get their salaries, but they never get paid.
Actually, they've been investigated, and I understand that some of the properties by one of the governors, who was actually a prominent governor, was actually seized by the EFCC, and some others who are also connected with, under this so-called Paris Club scandal, some of those who are connected with the current Senate president, who was allegedly a beneficiary of some of the diversion of the fund, were arrested by EFCC, and they made some very good revelations on how they were used, and their names and companies were actually used to steal some of those funds, and then the investigation is still on. But that is the issue. You've got about 36 of them. It takes a whole lot of time and effort to investigate them and get to the root of the matter. And quite a number of them are smart about going into many of these funds. But the key thing, which is very crucial, is that the president cannot pretend to know that some of these things are happening. It is impossible for the federal government to continue playing the ostrich and saying, just go and pay, and then you pay money to them. If it is not done, there must be a benchmark, a standard that must be set by the government to say, we need to have a minimum of this. So there must be the defray of those outstanding salaries to measure up to amount given to the states before you can talk about paying additional money, if genuinely the purpose is to...
Because, from our last check, we still have some states that are owing as much as 7-month salaries. Some are owing as much as 8-month salaries.
Right.
There is even a narrative of, oh, we are not the one owing, it's the local governments that are owing. And you keep asking yourself, if they are working in your state, aren't you supposed to be bothered?
It's just an escapist excuse that doesn't actually hold water. The governors in many of the states, they actually expend the resources of the local government. And you can do a check. Most of the local governments don't have autonomy in terms of the utilization of their resources. Their resources are usually utilized by them. And it is across border, across the federation.
It brings us to the sad tale of the corruption and how the scale of corruption in the land. We've heard of how this has been before this government came into power and how this is pulling us back. Mr. Ibrahim Agu did say, look, this corruption is making us look bad in the Committee of Nations. But then the issue will be, the government of the day says, look, criticize us, but don't mock us. But before we will say we're not mocking you, we need to get a clearance, a clarity and closure into the narrative of whether you truly are fighting corruption. From your own standpoint, do you think this government is fighting corruption?
Yes, I think the government through the EFCC is fighting corruption. But the government as a whole still has a huge question mark in its commitment to the fight against corruption. And it's very simple. It's a function of, it would have been excusable if the only anti-corruption agency in this country is the EFCC. But where you have ICPC, you have Code of Conduct Bureau, you have the Special Fraud Unit of the police, and they are still operating like in the past, then you would want to wonder, where is the commitment and genuineness of the whole anti-corruption mantra of the government? So when you look at it, I don't really think that the government is yet to come to terms with what is actually required to fight corruption. Majorly, EFCC is not to prevent corruption, and that is why it only can go after those who have committed a crime.
But the Code of Conduct could actually prevent.
Have been doing that, and that is not happening.
But the ICPC is supposed to fight corruption in the public sector.
Yeah, and nothing is really happening with the agency as well.
That, so when it comes to even a budgeting process, that's, I mean, the public sector, the civil service is where most of the corruption is allegedly.
Actually, EFCC, that is why I said EFCC is fighting corruption. It's going outside even the immediate expected responsibility of it. It has the power to enforce laws of EFCC and Code of Conduct Bureau, and the laws of ICPC and Code of Conduct Bureau. But when you now want to check which of them is most even powerful in terms of the broadness of its power, is the ICPC. So it is even the ICPC meant to fight corruption, while
more than any other agency,
do financial crimes and money, economic and financial crimes.
If you look at the issue, you said that it doesn't look like this government of the day is committed to it. But do you have instances where you think the government should have taken a bolder steps because what you're talking about looks so much like a perception issue?
Yeah, no, it's not perception, it is real. When you want to look at, I've not really seen in the history of this government, and that is where you have the contradiction in this government. It is about the government with the real commitment to say we want to fight corruption. It is also about the government that is undoing itself from within in the greatest mantra that I can actually imagine. Ask yourself, in the last 2 years, the Office of the Attorney General has not, as the Office of the Attorney General, successfully prosecuted any individual for corruption. ICPC, you can't talk of even high-profile person in the public sector, except for the EFCC. You go to the Code of Conduct Bureau, it is the same thing. The last one was with Orubebe, and the same thing with the Senate President, Bukola Saraki. They lost the cases, and the whole thing is just waiting there in limbo. And you would want to also start looking at those who are within. The judges were invaded by the state security services. How many of them have been charged by the state security service of the or the Office of the Attorney General?
Because of our time, Mr. Suraj, we need to go now. If you are to say something and advise the president right now on this issue of anti-corruption, just in 30 seconds, what do you think the president must do? If you don't want Nigerians to mock you and criticize you, what would you be advising?
Yeah, it needs to actually take control of the government. It needs to sack many of its current ministers and advisors. It needs to ensure the immediate and conclusive prosecution of those who are accused of corruption and are associated with the president. It needs to empower the EFCC more, and not a situation where the government is mocked, like I said, from the within. The mockery is from within. You see what happened with the former DG SSS last week. You saw what happened with the former NIA director. There's nowhere that you have that happening in government. The EFCC has the power to investigate even the president.
Wow.
It cannot be arrested. The governors can be investigated. The president can be investigated. Wow. And I wonder where you want to talk about a regulation that you can't investigate a security. When Alex Bade, a former chief of defense staff, was investigated and arrested. Right. When I'm also a former chief of air staff, I was also investigated and arrested.
Mr. Olariwaju Suraj, always a pleasure having you. It does always look like we never start talking anyways. But thank you so much, Mr. Olariwaju Suraj.
Always my pleasure.
Thank you so much. We'll take a moment. You know, channels always have something in the bag. We always have one surprise or the other for you. Stick with us. We'll be right back to unveil the surprise we have for you at the station. Join us again.